Hello, and welcome to Online with SFFP. I'm Kathy Rose O'Regan, the Executive Director of San Francisco Film Preserve. SFFP's mission is to restore, preserve, and provide access to the world's cinematic heritage. We also host live events, with our next screening taking place at the Roxy Theatre in San Francisco on March 12th. Just in time for St. Patrick's Day, which, as you can probably guess, I have a vested interest in, we will be showing two films shot in Ireland during the silent era. 1912's You Remember Ellen, a narrative short made by the American O'Callum Company, well, Callum Company. When they made films in Ireland, they were referred to as the O'Callum movies, along with the Galt Collection, which is a collection of ethnographic footage filmed in Ireland by American ornithologist Benjamin True Galt between 1925 and 1926. This event will be accompanied live by two exceptional traditional Irish musicians, so it is really not to be missed if you are Bay Area based. In addition to restoring and preserving works of cinema, SFFP is dedicated to advocating for moving image preservation and bringing attention to the incredible work being performed worldwide by dedicated archivists, academics, and enthusiasts. We started this monthly online series to highlight just some of the incredible things happening in the world of film heritage. So today's presentation is by Aurore Spiers, author of Archiving the Past, Women's Film History in France 1927 to 1978, which is available from the University of California Press. This presentation will discuss how women contributed to the production of global film history by serving as archivists charged with collecting films and other materials, as witnesses tasked with remembering their own film careers, and as activists committed to recovering women's contributions to film history. It will focus primarily on the many women who collaborated with Henri Langlois at the Cinémathèque française, yet remained in his shadow. Aurore Spiers is Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies in the College of Performance, Visualization and Fine Arts and the Women's and Gender Studies program at Texas A&M University. Mainly focused on women's contributions to film and media, her work interrogates historiographical processes, what history gets written, how and why, through the lens of gender and intersectional feminism. It asks why women and other marginalized groups have so often been forgotten and what strategies, critical, creative, speculative, etc., may be employed against historical erasure. Since 2013, she has been an editorial contributor to the Women Film Pioneers Project. Today's talk will be followed by a Q&A, so if you have any questions, please just pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. But for now, I would like to welcome Aurore Spiers to the screen.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Let me just set up my screen here. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to San Francisco Film Preserve and to Kathy O'Regan for hosting me. I've enjoyed their online events tremendously, so it's a great honor for me to be here today. I also wish to express my gratitude to all attendees from joining us from all over the world, it seems like, based on the chat. It's quite wonderful. And I finally want to thank San Francisco Film Preserve for the fabulous work that they do, making global film history more accessible through both restoration and curatorial programs and projects. As I'll discuss today, I think that the work, not only helps historians like myself, but also contributes in its own right to the production of film historical knowledge in important ways. So I will dive right in. I'll start with a brief preamble. The idea that film history was worth preserving received wider acceptance in the 1920s, when some of the first archives entirely dedicated to the cinema emerged around the world. Drawing on my first book, Archiving the Past, Women's Film History in France, 1927-1978, and on new original research, this presentation addresses how women contributed to the production of global film history by serving as archivists charged with collecting films and other materials, as witnesses tasked with remembering their own film careers, and as activists committed to recovering women's contributions to film history. In Archiving the Past, which was just released in Shelley Stem's book series, Feminist Media Histories from University of California Press, I examine how women, other than historians, produce film history through multiple varied forms of engagement with the archive. My case studies comes from France and go from the 20s to the 70s, and I can say a little bit more in the Q&A about why that is. Chapter 1 focuses on the archivists of the Bibliothèque du Cinéma and the Cinémathèque nationale, mainly Janou Sinac and Laure Albin Guyot. Here you've got Laure Albin Guyot pictured, who were among the first to not only assemble but also organize archival materials related to cinema history in the 1920s and 30s. Chapter 2 examines how many other women functioned as important witnesses whose memories of the first few decades of the French cinema were crucial to the Commission of Historical Research of the Cinémathèque française. And that commission was led by none other than Musidora, who you see pictured here. Chapter 3 studies the historiographical work of the feminist film collective named after Musidora, specifically how they put pressure on the masculinist biases of French film archives and ultimately recovered some of the contributions of Alice Guy Blaché in the 1970s. Members of the Musidora collective were amateur film and video makers with day jobs outside the movie industry, but like the other women from archiving the past, they served functions that made them key but often invisible agents in the production of film historical knowledge. By taking seriously how these women worked in and with the film archive across times and places, Archiving the Past recast the film archive as a site of women's intervention. The book also contributes to a more complex understanding of how gender politics informs the production of global film history. It reflects on film history's biases, oversights, and erasures, and models strategies for inclusivity, recuperation, and liberation within film historiography. And as I write in the book's epilogue, my hope with the book is that more scholars will see these women too, and that better feminist futures will become possible as a result of our looking for their work anywhere and everywhere all the time. Since the publication of Archiving the Past, I myself uncovered more women whose work in and with the film archive deserves further attention. In what follows, I'll focus primarily on the many women who collaborated with Henri Langlois at the Cinémathèque française, yet remain in his shadow. In 1932, French film critic Lucienne Escoubet asked what men, far-sighted and generous, would take on the urgent mission of preserving silent cinema. As she and others expressed around that time, sound cinema, which had been introduced in France with the release of The Jazz Singer in 1929, provoked anxieties not only about the medium's future, but also about its fairly young past. Even though silent films were still being produced, many feared that sound cinema would cause the complete obliteration of the recently established art of silent cinema. What France needed, in this film critic's words, was a cinemathèque dedicated to collecting films and other materials and led by a man with both vision and resources. In hindsight, some might say that Henri Langlois, as co-founder of the Cinémathèque française in 1936, was to be the providential man called for by the emergence of sound cinema in France in the 1930s. Yet the film preservation movement has always been a women's affair. Women have served many roles in the cinema, of course, as actresses, directors, producers, camera operators, screenwriters, editors, casting directors, critics, curators, and more. They have also been actively involved, as I show, in the writing and preservation of global cinema's history, including right alongside Henri Langlois at the Cinémathèque française. The other co-founder of the Cinémathèque, Georges Franju, himself once stated that at the beginning, the Cinémathèque, quote, operated thanks to three women, Madame Germaine Dulac, who brought us film professionals, Mademoiselle Suzanne Borel, who gave us access to the diplomatic pouch at the Ministère des Affaires étrangères, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Madame Yvonne Dornès from the Présidence du Conseil, who supported us administratively, end quote. These three women were indeed crucial to the Cinémathèque, not only early on, but throughout and even after Langlois' tenure. Yet Franju counts among the very few who have discussed such women's work in a positive light. If mentioned at all, the women of the Cinémathèque française are more often described in misogynistic terms, as emotional beings whose mercurial behaviors and strong jealousy between each other caused regular trouble over the years. But in examining several archival collections from the Cinémathèque, mainly its historical and administrative archives, I found out that the extent of women's work at the Cinémathèque goes even beyond what Frangi once suggested. Women served as administrators, as archivists, and secretaries, whose jobs, when clearly defined, had to do with not only proper film preservation, but also business management, public relations, sales, office work, custodian work, etc. Recovering these women's contributions allows us to write a more inclusive history of film preservation. And as we feminist film historians reclaim the archive as a site for women's intervention in the cinema, which my book Archiving the Past encourages us to do, we also bring to the fore how gendered experiences of both film and work have shaped and continue to shape the archive in key ways, from its low wages to its lack of social recognition. We ultimately move closer to giving not only women but also film archives their due credit in the production of global cultural historiographies. While passion certainly drives the film preservation movement, a lot of work too goes into it that should be acknowledged. And so I'll talk first about administrators and then archivists and then secretaries. And I'm hoping this won't, sound too much like a catalog of various names, but I will be talking about a lot of different people, just to give you, a sense of the breadth of women's work at the Cinémathèque française. First started in January 1936, but officially registered as a nonprofit organization on September 9, 1936, the Cinémathèque initially consisted of an administrative council that included founding members, benefactors, and trustees, as well as a president, vice president, general secretary, treasurer, delegate to the FIAF after 1938, and someone in charge of propaganda in the 1940s. As co-founder and general secretary from 1936 through his death in 1977, Langlois was the Cinémathèque's unofficial director behind virtually all decisions, operations, and projects. Yet, the Cinémathèque could never function without the rest of its administrative council members, especially several women from the French film industry and the French government. In its early years, the Cinémathèque relied almost exclusively on the unpaid labor of these dedicated female administrators to achieve its goal of preserving and showing repertoire films. Among the women serving as administrators to the Cinémathèque, Germaine Dulac, Yvonne Dornès, and Suzanne Borel, so the three women that Frangi mentioned, were certainly the most influential. A key figure of the French film avant-garde in the 1920s, Dulac retained a lot of power in the 30s and 40s that she used to support the Cinémathèque. During that time, she worked as a producer and director of fiction films and newsreels at Gaumont-Franco Film Aubert, where she supervised several projects in line with the socialist ideals of the Popular Front. She was also deeply involved in union activities, as well as several feminist organizations and pacifist groups aimed at promoting French, mostly educational cinema. At the Cinémathèque, Dulac was among the first filmmakers to deposit copies and negatives of her films, including La Souriante Madame Bedet, The Smiling Madame Bedet from 1923. As a founding member and vice president in charge of relations with FIAF, she also helped negotiate with FIAF's president and Nazi official Frank Hensel during World War II. Not only did she manage to retrieve some French and foreign films that occupying Nazi forces attempted to confiscate and or destroy, she also secured permission for the Cinémathèque to resume some of its pre-war activities during the occupation, which ultimately ensured its long-term survival. I mean, all things considered, the Cinémathèque française did pretty well during the war. After her death on July 19, 1942, Langlois stated that, quote, "There's no denying Germaine Dulac's importance to the cinema. As far as the Cinémathèque is concerned, there is not a day, not a minute, when Germaine Dulac's absence from her midst is not felt. We can see how important she had become to the Cinémathèque française," end quote. Yvonne Dornès is certainly less recognizable than Dulac today, but she was also an early collaborator of Langlois at the Cinémathèque. Born to a family of high-ranking officials, politicians, and intellectuals, Dornès worked for the French government in various capacities from the 30s through the 40s, primarily at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at the Prime Minister's Office, and the Ministry of Information. During her tenure at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister's office, she also served as General Secretary to the Leftist Cultural Association May 36, whose film section Tammy Williams tells us was headed by Dulac and, quote, affiliated with major figures from several generations of filmmaking, including director Jean Renoir and Jacqueline Audry, an exceptional 1940s, 50s female cinema of quality filmmaker, end quote. To May 36, Dornès, Dulac, and many others not only supported the production, distribution, and exhibition of educational films within working-class neighborhoods, but they also worked towards the nationalization of the French film industry. The belief that cinema should be accessible to the masses undoubtedly motivated Dornès's involvement with the Cinémathèque. Starting in 1936, when Langlois first visited her office at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then as an official member of the Cinémathèque's Administrative Council after 1938, she secured government support for the Cinémathèque, financial and otherwise, and importantly arranged for the free exchange of films between the Cinémathèque and several international archives. During World War II, she not only met with FIAF President Frank Hensel, at least once in Vichy, which was incredibly dangerous for her because she was part of the French resistance. She also provided trucks used to move films from Paris to the Free Zone, and those trucks she got from the telephone information company Service Victoire Paris that she was in charge of. She was heading it between 1943 and 1953, so she had many different hats. Furthermore, Dornès likely made possible for Lotte Eisner to find, so I'll talk a little bit about Eisner later, but I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Lotte Eisner. So Dornès likely made possible for Eisner to find refuge from persecution during World War II at the Château de Béduet near Figeac in the southwest of France. But the chateau was owned by the lawyer, writer, and publisher Jeanne Le Viton, with whom Dornès was rumored to be romantically involved. And Dornès was, it was an open secret that Dornès was gay, and it was actually not talked about in very nice and respectful ways most of the time, at least in the testimonies that I found. In the early 1950s, and then as president of the Cinémathèque from 1977 through 1988, so right after Langlois' death, Dornès was responsible for restoring order to the administration, finances, and collections of the Cinémathèque. It was a notorious mess. As filmmaker Jean Rouch once stated, she was the, quote, undisputed mistress of disorder, end quote, maîtresse incontestée du désordre in French, whose work provided support and stability during and after Langlois' tenure. Like Dornès, Suzanne Borel had strong connections with the French government of the 1930s that would benefit the Cinémathèque. The first woman to pass the entrance exam to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Borel was assistant to Yves Chategnaud, also a member of the Cinémathèque, at the Service des Œuvres Works Department from 1930 through 37, and then she was head of that same service from 37 through 39. It was during those years that Borel most contributed to the development of the Cinémathèque. As she recalls in her memoir, the service coordinated French government institutions abroad, including Lycée and Alliance Française, as well as various other efforts to promote French culture on a global scale. Borel herself was in charge of exporting French films abroad, which was how she met not only Dornès, but also Langlois and Franju in 1936. She writes that we, Borel and perhaps her colleagues, were able to facilitate Henri Langlois' efforts abroad by recommending him to our representatives, and it would have taken much longer for the Cinémathèque's collection to grow if we hadn't ensured the transport by diplomatic pouch of the films collected outside France. End quote. After she officially joined the Administrative Council of the Cinémathèque Française in 1938, Borel remained an important figure of the Cinémathèque, perhaps briefly as its head of propaganda, I'm not sure, it's not very clear, and then as one of its best connected members. She participated in the French resistance during World War II, and she worked as chief of staff for the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Georges Bidault, for just a few months starting in 1944. Her career in diplomacy ended when she married Bidault on December 27, 1945. And although she served as a close collaborator to her husband during his long and illustrious political career, Borel, who now went by the name Suzanne Bidault, never held another official position in the French government. Yet she continued to serve the Cinémathèque in important ways as Langlois' close personal friend and as longtime member and advisor. The other women that would be worth mentioning, I'll focus on Mary Meerson. I'll just say a few words about Mary Meerson. When it comes to her, actually, she was set designer Lazare Meerson's widow and Langlois' life partner starting around 1941. And when it comes to her exact position at the Cinémathèque is indeed, it's quite tricky to describe, actually. Not only was she never officially on the Cinémathèque's payroll, but she also exerted a fascination that often clouded any assessment of her work. Once known for her stunning looks, she had been as beautiful as Marlene Dietrich, Lotte Eisner used to say. Meerson later distinguished herself for her mysterious past, her thick Eastern European accent, her corpulence, her extravagance, her temperament, and her hold over Langlois, which commentators sometimes blamed for the Cinémathèque's financial troubles. But her many contacts with film professionals from the time when Lazare Meerson was still alive, not to mention her labor and decade-long devotion to the Cinémathèque, were undoubtedly essential to both Langlois and the Cinémathèque. Based on primary sources from the Cinémathèque that I was able to look at, and it's somewhat a bizarre assortment of personal letters and work memos. You've got some really heated correspondence between Meerson and Langlois, but also just like orders for various supplies in the office, things like that. Based on this bizarre assortment of archival materials, Meerson accomplished various tasks from public relations to print trafficking to acquisitions to office management, all of which contributed to the good operations of the Cinémathèque. She, perhaps even more than Dulac, Dornès, and Borel, became central to the Cinémathèque's everyday, and her work was certainly directly connected to that of archivists, many of whom were also women. As the Cinémathèque's activities moved beyond collecting and screening films into acquiring non-filmic archival materials, curating exhibits, and facilitating historical research in the 40s and 50s, it became organized in several specialized commissions and departments for which new employees, mostly female archivists, film inspectors, editors, secretaries, and stenographer typists were hired. To be sure, the Cinémathèque's activities and employees varied based on budget and other contingencies over the years, not only during World War II, but also during the post-war and decolonization period. When subventions from the French government improved in 1944, for example, the Cinémathèque added more personnel. But while the number of employees might have dropped in the late 40s, about 60 people, including Langlois and Dornès, were apparently on the Cinémathèque's payroll in the late 50s. Regardless of these fluctuations, women, many of whom were archivists, remained the backbone, I think, of the institution during Langlois' tenure as general secretary. One of the Cinémathèque's earliest archivists was Musidora, whose famed career as a silent film actress, writer, director, and producer not only justified but also informed her work with Langlois. And here, this is just one example of, so it's one of the films that Musidora co-directed in the 1920s, Pour Don Carlos, which was beautifully restored by San Francisco Film Preserve. Although she had been less active in cinema since the end of the 1920s, Musidora remained a key public figure with connections to many filmmakers and other artists throughout the 1930s and 40s. The Cinémathèque française first invited her to discuss Gaumont star director Louis Feuillade during a meeting of the newly formed Commission of Historical Research, I'm going to call it the CRH, whose goal since 1943 had been to interview pioneers of French cinema. Langlois then quickly charged, so interestingly enough, she wasn't invited to talk about her own career, but really the career of Feuillade. Langlois then quickly charged Musidora with leading the CRH, which meant sending requests to participants, hiring a stenographer typist, and securing locations. During meetings, she, together with Langlois and Georges Chadoul, Jean Mitry, and others, questioned pioneers about their work methods and practices. And based on many extant documents from the CRH collection, and you see just a couple here, she was also responsible for collecting, reviewing, revising, and filing transcripts after the interviews took place. In 1946, Musidora became head of the Service de Documentation et de Relations avec la Presse, Documentation and Press Relations Department, that officially handled, among others, the non-filmic archives and the CRH. And she continued to organize the CRH meetings until at least 1952, but she stayed at the Cinémathèque until her death on December 7, 1957. Besides the CRH, one of the first departments that the Cinémathèque organized was the Service Technique, Technical Services, dedicated to film preservation and staffed with mostly female archivists. In 1944, when the Cinémathèque's film collections had become not only sizable, but also scattered due to the Nazi occupation of France, the Administrative Council asked Louis Didier, a well-respected engineer from Kodak Pathé, A. Kister, a former employee of Pathé Consortium Cinéma, and several other male members to set up a technical commission that would employ many women over the following decades. Although Kister was soon after designated to lead the commission, now considered a department, he worked with several new female hires, Léon Moreau, Louise Thomas, and Léontine Chardon. And I don't have pictures for them. They were responsible for managing the Cinémathèque's film collections, which consisted of storing, classifying, and cleaning old prints, as well as ordering new prints to be used during screenings. In some cases, unedited elements required that archivists work with directors and/or their collaborators to reconstruct their films as they had intended them to be seen. The various jobs that archivists performed were highly skilled, yet no, at least as far as I know, no formal training existed that would have taught them about film preservation before working for the Cinémathèque. Several of them, including Kister and later on Marie Epstein, Yvonne Martin, and René Lichtig, were industry professionals who already knew from years of practical experience how to handle and edit film. Their expertise and skills undoubtedly shaped film preservation practices at the Cinémathèque and beyond. Take, for instance, René Lichtig, whose father, Arnold Lichtig, had worked with Dulac on newsreels for Gaumont, and whose sister, Lucie Lichtig, was a renowned script girl and later a life member of the Cinémathèque's Administrative Council. And here you see René Lichtig with Jean Renoir. René herself worked as an intern doing color grading for the Studio d'Épinay, previously Éclair, when she met Langlois during one of the Cinémathèque screenings, probably in the late 1940s or early 50s. As she recollected later in life, we hit it off, and I started collaborating from time to time with the Cinémathèque. Langlois first entrusted me with the editing of a 60mm film about Chagall. He then told Erich von Stroheim, who was looking to restore the Wedding March, about me. So I continued to make small repairs for the Cinémathèque until my mother told me that I couldn't work in film without being paid anymore. So I became an assistant editor on some films. From then on, I told Henri Langlois that I was available to the Cinémathèque between shoots. On Saturdays and Sundays, I would let him use the editing rooms in which I worked. My work at the Cinémathèque consisted essentially in joining all films from the silent era that Langlois wanted to screen to the public, end quote. Lichtig's work on the Wedding March deserves further elaboration, not only because that particular restoration was, according to Richard Kosarsky, quote, one of the first instances of a film archive taking over what had previously been considered a strictly commercial responsibility, end quote, but also because Lichtig and the rest of the Service Technique would work on many more similar projects, of course, in subsequent years. Lichtig already knew Stroheim and his partner Denise Vernac from serving as trainee script supervisor and assistant, actually, to her sister Lucie on one of their French films, La Danse de Mort from 1948. In 1943, she worked with them again, this time on Stroheim's magnum opus, The Wedding March, a silent print of which Stroheim had recently found. Together, they re-edited scenes for better rhythm and dramatic impact and added the musical score and sound effect that had been in the original version. The process of synchronization was technically difficult, but quite rewarding, wrote Lichtig in an article, for Cahiers du Cinéma several months after the restoration premiered at the 1954 São Paulo Film Festival in Brazil. She said, limited by the very short time, Eric von Stroheim, Denise Vernac, so Stroheim's partner, and I worked for almost 8 days and nights in the editing room, and that will remain one of my fondest memories as an editor, end quote. Several years later, after Langlois' death, Mary Meerson asked the Cinémathèque's administrative council to recruit Lichtig for the Service Technique, where she would stay from 78 through 93. Lichtig, now one of the main archivists responsible for inspecting film prints, requested, very importantly, that more employees be added, better equipment be purchased, and all films be looked at before screenings. She also reconstructed many more films, including several directed by Jean Epstein, Jacques Feder, and Ivan Mojoukin from the Cinémathèque's illustrious Albatros collection. Another key figure from the Cinémathèque Service Technique was Mary Epstein, a screenwriter, director, and editor of silent and early sound fiction films, and the sister of filmmaker and film theorist Jean Epstein. Jean and Marie Epstein were early supporters and members of the Cinémathèque. In 1954, so soon after Jean's death, Marie joined the Cinémathèque as one of its employees. And according to Epstein herself, she first assisted Musidora in the preservation of posters and set design models, and became the director of the Service Technique only after Musidora's death in 1957. And recently, Émilie Coquille and Marie Frappa have done really great work and paid very close attention to the traces of Epstein's labor in the archives of the Cinémathèque. In addition to inventorying films, they explained that Epstein was in charge of ordering new prints from various labs, which made it possible to screen, for example, a great number of Lumière films in the 1960s. And by the time she retired in 1980, she had also reconstructed many films with the help of filmmakers or based on extant documents, including Abel Gance's La Roue and Napoléon, René Clair's Entr'acte, and the films of Marie's brother Jean Epstein, for example, Le Lion des Mogols and La Glace à Trois Faces. Working alongside mostly Musidora and Epstein for several years was Lotte Eisner, whose name remains very familiar among cinephiles and scholars alike. But while she's better known today, perhaps, as a film historian, Eisner spent the majority of her professional life working as the chief curator of the Cinémathèque, where she was responsible for mostly non-filmic archives from 1945 through 1975. As a German Jewish film critic in Paris, where she had come to escape Hitler's regime in 1933, Eisner found new friends in Langlois, Franjus, and their Cineclub's members, so the Cineclub that then would end up kind of starting the Cinémathèque. She also immediately supported the Two Young Men's project to collect films that would form the basis of an archive dedicated to the cinema. She not only helped organize Langlois' existing prints, but also scouted out more at flea markets and old movie theaters, for example. As mentioned before, she spent several months during World War II in hiding in the southwest of France, where she looked after some of the Cinémathèque's films. And after the war, she was officially hired as the Cinémathèque's primary archivist, whose extensive knowledge of German and other national cinemas, and whose connections to many filmmakers and movie workers from her time in Berlin in the 1920s would become indispensable for several decades. Among many other things, she acquired and proudly cataloged, with the assistance after 1957 of Françoise Carvillani, the majority of non-filmic materials like scripts and set design drawings still in the Cinémathèque's collections today. He also wrote essays and 3 major books on Weimar cinema, The Haunted Screen, F.W. Murnau, and Fritz Lang, that certainly contributed to the Cinémathèque's work and prestige. Finally, the secretaries of the Cinémathèque. While secretaries counted among the Cinémathèque's earliest employees, they have been the least visible, valued, and documented over the years. Their involvement since the late 1930s certainly attests to the importance of these women as close collaborators with Langlois, Franjus, Eisner, and more. At the same time, few names are known besides Julia Veronesi, Madeleine Maltête-Méliès, Françoise Jobert, Marie-Claude Deschamps, Anne-Marie Glorger, Alice Baucher, Yvonne Catala, Mademoiselle Schwab, Mademoiselle Delcros, and Mademoiselle Roussel. And even fewer accounts remain in the administrative and historical archives of the Cinémathèque that do justice to their contributions. Their lives and careers are pieced together here based on fragmentary primary sources and secondary sources about secretarial work. The Cinémathèque's secretaries were women of various ages, either single, married, or widowed. They performed typical women's work and served as administrative assistants, stenographer typists, and telephone operators whose labor, although not directly pertaining to film preservation, supported the Cinémathèque's administrators and archivists in important ways. For example, during the CRH interviews organized by Musidora in the 40s and 50s, Mademoiselle Roussel and other stenographer typists produced transcripts that historians may still access today for valuable information about early French filmmakers and movie workers. Interestingly enough, some of the Cinémathèque secretaries themselves had connections to the film industry. It was the case for several of Langlois' assistants, including Madeleine Maltête-Méliès, whose grandfather was film pioneer Georges Méliès, and also you had Française Jobert, whose father was film music composer Maurice Jobert. Other skills having to do with so-called emotional labor, defined here as labor usually non-quantifiable that aims to create a workable environment for oneself and others, were likely required from the Cinémathèque secretaries. As far as I know, no first-hand accounts exist that would help us better understand the work experiences of secretaries at the Cinémathèque. But one may speculate, based on descriptions of the Cinémathèque's general ethos, since the 1930s, that secretaries and likely other women had to perform that kind of emotional labor. For instance, Rouge once stated that Dornès was, quote, certainly Langlois' lifeline when he did whatever pleased him, and when he had a huge problem with what we rather unkindly called Henri's harem, meaning all the women who worked with the Langlois, Meerson, Eisner, the Lichtig sisters, and Epstein, among others. It was not an easy task because these women were very jealous of each other, and I think Yvonne Dornès played a key role in bringing calm to this group of women who hated and adored each other at the same time because they shared a common love for Henri, end quote. Whereas Rouge's description of Langlois' harem is clearly misogynistic, it also attests to, without naming it as such, the kind of emotional labor that Dornès and other women performed at the Cinémathèque. Because of the job titles and lower status among employees, secretaries were perhaps expected to take on the brunt of that labor, to mediate conflicts, answer complaints, and manage inappropriate behavior, for example. They certainly performed typical women's work, highly skilled and necessary on the one hand, and vastly underpaid and undervalued on the other. To conclude, I'll just say a few words about film archival work as women's work. Often considered in mythical terms as a center for French and global cinephilia, the Cinémathèque has also been a place of work whose many female members and employees from the 1930s through the 70s experienced both common and unique challenges. On the one hand, poor government funding, low wages, understaffing, and scarce material resources often made difficult the Cinémathèque's day-to-day operations, from film storage and cataloging to inspection and screening. By the end of 1951, for example, the Cinémathèque still did not have a working catalog that would have helped organize its film collections at the military fort of Bois d'Arcy outside Paris. When prints were needed for screenings at the Cinémathèque, so on Avenue de Messine in the 8th arrondissement in Paris, the warehouse men could rarely locate them on his own. And one woman, Léon Moreau, would apparently, from the technical services, would apparently spend her days from 9 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night at Bois d'Arcy, instructed him, the warehousemen, and young volunteers on where to find specific films. Langlois explained, meanwhile, everything stood still in Paris, end quote, where Moreau's team of mostly female film inspectors and editors awaiting her return to get prints ready for the projectionists. While such situation put unusual pressure on mostly female employees, it was nevertheless routine at the Cinémathèque due to systemic lack of funding. On the other hand, many problems arose at the Cinémathèque that should be traced back to Langlois' eccentric, to say the least, personality, which historians too often brush off, I think, as anecdotal, or even celebrate as key to the passionate collector's success. It has been common historical knowledge, for example, that Langlois maintained tumultuous relationships with various French and international institutions, including FIAF, which rightly accused him of poor management and deception. Well, rightly, it seems like it was rightly. He was rightly accused of poor management and deception. Based on testimony, Langlois was not only disorganized, but also prone to anger, superstition, jealousy, and paranoia, which employees likely experienced firsthand within their own offices. Yet such difficult work environment also fostered solidarity among at least some of its female employees. As Epstein once said about her first few months at the Cinémathèque, the beginnings were difficult. I had to go through a purgatory of distrust before entering the paradise of trust. I could never express how much help I received from two women who immediately took me in with an open heart, Musidora and Lotte Eisner. Musidora was by then a charming old lady who had been tasked with restoring set design models and, above all, who had made the Cinémathèque a meeting place and a home for older filmmakers, especially those among them who were already on the verge of moral and material oblivion. I don't need to tell you what Lotte Eisner did. Langlois said it himself. We owe 2/3 of the treasures in the Musée du Cinéma to her contribution. She has been a precious friend to me. More generally, Epstein talked about the fever, the enthusiasm with which they organized the big events. And she said Henri galvanized everyone, which might have eased but not eliminated the complicated conditions in which women worked at the Cinémathèque. That most employees of the Cinémathèque have been women is certainly no coincidence. They demonstrated skills that were not just expected from them, but also more often accessible through school training for stenographer typists, for example, and apprenticeship for film editors. It is through such skills that the Cinémathèque and other film archives around the world develop and thrived, and that they continue to shape cinema's history today. As women's work, film preservation also remains critically undervalued. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aurore. That was just utterly fascinating. Your depth of research is to be envied by the rest of us. Really something else. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will get to as many as we can between now and 1 o'clock San Francisco time. But I have questions myself. So I'm really interested to know, Aurore, how you came to this line of inquiry. Like what is it about the history of women's archiving labor that drew you in?
Yeah, it's this most of the research into the Cinémathèque française came kind of, I had of course done a little bit for the book, but I then really dived more into all these different women after the book was done. But the book really started, I mean, it has a complicated history. It's based on my dissertation, and I changed dissertation topics kind of late. But what the first thing that kind of brought me to think about women's engagement with the film archives and sort of women who were not film historians was really the work of the Musidora collective in the 70s, because I was interested in Alice Guy Blaché, and I was reading, her memoirs in French, and I noticed, that her memoirs, the first edition that was published in France, was published by these two women that I had never heard of. I mean, they wrote the preface and they apparently edited the book, and I, started looking into them, and they were part of this collective, and then I kind of just more questions, right? I had just more questions came up. I was like, okay, who are they? How did they get the memoirs? What are their interests in Alice Guy Blaché? I looked at, so they not only published the memoirs, but then they also did, they programmed the first Women's Film Festival in France in 1974. And in that festival, they showed the work of contemporary filmmakers and some video works too, but they also showed films by Alice Guy and other early women pioneers. And I was really curious how they'd even heard of them, because it was before kind of women's film history was established as a field. So just diving into the kind of historical work that they had access to, like secondary sources they had access to, but also primary sources that they had access to, I realized that the work that they were doing was historiographical work, but they were not historians, right? So then that kind of started this line of just my kind of project to expand, our understanding of what counts as as film history, right? It's not just work done by historians, but it's the work of, like I say in the book, right? I mean, archivists, of course, but also witnesses, right, that share their testimonies, especially in the silent era. There are so many women, right? And they did show up in those interviews at the Cinémathèque française talking about their work, but again, that wasn't really like written about. And then they're also activists, right? Not just sort of contributing to the work of film archives, but also sometimes outside of those established places, they push against, right? That's certainly what the Musidora Film Collective was doing. They pushed against the biases of the film archives. There's this amazing interview that I write about in the book where they have archivists and historians on a radio show, and they really just ask them, why don't we know about Alice Guy Blaché, and why aren't you talking about Alice Guy Blaché? So really calling them on their possible biases there. So that's how then, the Cinémathèque Française was part of the book, but I didn't end up writing a lot about the employees, the female employees of the Cinémathèque, and so that ended up as kind of like a side project that came out of the book. And just realizing again that there were so many women that you go to the archive and you see so many names of women, and I think and it's not archives that nobody's ever looked at, but I guess you return to the archive and you kind of see those names, and I was interested in those names, and so wanted to kind of make sense of their work.
And when you kind of realized the depth of work by women that had largely gone unrecognized, what were your avenues into discovering who these women were? Like, how did you tackle that enormous task?
Yeah, and then you've got the problem of sources. For this particular, for what I talked about mostly today, the women of the Cinémathèque Française, I use mostly so I was already really familiar with the Commission of Historical Research, so the stuff that Musidora did, the transcripts and all that. So that's in the book already. So I looked at those transcripts, and you see I read them for, the information that they give you about pioneers, but I also read them as material documents, like looking at, the Musidora's handwriting, which is absolutely everywhere. And so I started to reconstruct, her work based on that. And then I was, for the rest, I was lucky to get access to the Cinémathèque's administrative archives, which are not, I don't think, like, if you look up on their catalog, I don't think online, I don't think they actually come up. But I was told about them by an archivist at the Cinémathèque Française when I visited, and you need special permission to access them, which the director was really grateful for him to give me the permission. And then those are not complete, and because of the Cinémathèque's history, it's the moments, it was a little bit of a mess at times, and so the archives are far from complete, but there are some even like employee registers that give you the names for a certain time period. So, and actually one that was really interesting was a book where they wrote down the accidents, like the work accidents, and the how do you call that? Like when people went on medical leave.
Okay.
Like they would, that kind of documentation. So they have some about, so that's how you find out about, a lot of the custodian, like a lot of the cleaning people were women. And so you have their names, and a lot of the secretaries. So when something bad happened to them at work, that's when they kind of show up in the archive,
That's
right?
how you end up being marked in history if something bad happens to you, as a woman specifically.
Yeah, no, exactly. But very fragmentary, right? So you kind of have to piece it together, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list that I gave you today. There are many more, and still more to learn.
Yeah. So we have a few questions here. Marilyn Ferdinand is wondering if men were generally the bosses at these archives and museums. Was there always, in the era that you covered, was it always a man in charge, or were there women leading any of these institutions?
No, at the Cinémathèque française, I mean, Langlois, of course, was had a hand in everything, it seems like, and was the boss. But they no, Lotte Eisner was the head of kind of the non-filmic. I mean, she was. I think the titles. It's difficult sometimes because the titles are not always reported like
Yeah.
consistently, and they're not always called the same. Again, because of the kind of chaos that the Cinematheque was at times. So but she's called sometimes like head archivist, for example. And so she seemed to have been completely in charge of the non-filmic
Mhm.
material. And same for Musidora, she was definitely in charge of the Commission of Historical Research. Same for the technical service. It was Marie Epstein who was the head of the technical services for a very long time. So I would say they were for sure heading the different commissions and services and departments.
Okay. And actually, this refers to Musidora as well. Kevin Rooney says, fascinating class, thank you. Is the Musidora Collective still active today? And a side question, which is a little morbid, as a projectionist, were any of these people around for that nitrate disaster in 1897 at
Mm.
Bazar de la Charité? Always curious about that history.
Mm. Yeah, the Musidora Collective is not active today. Many of so they didn't end up lasting very long. I think they kind of dissolved around 1977 after doing so they did a first women's film festival in France. They published the Alice Guy Blaché memoirs. They did a few other programs in France, and they published some other articles and books. But yeah, they kind of dissolved. I think maybe because of a lack of money. I
Yeah.
think ultimately. But some of the members are still around, and I was lucky to talk to one of them, Dana Sardé. She's American actually, but was in France, and I'm very grateful to her because I um, finally found her contact when the manuscript was due, and I emailed her kind of panicked, asking if I could talk to her within the next few days because I had to send in the manuscript, and she agreed. And she was also in the middle of traveling. I mean, she was just like so nice, and her yeah retelling of that time was really important for me to better understand actually the level of engagement that I mean she herself went to the Cinémathèque Française, met with Mary Meerson, who then gave her access to like some material about the women, early women film pioneers. So it's also like a connection there,
Yeah.
with the Cinémathèque. So it just kind of like worked beautifully. It was just so interesting to learn about. The fire of the Bazar de la Charité. I mean, I'm trying to think if the people interviewed by the Cinémathèque Française in the 40s and 50s mention it. I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to go back and double check, but otherwise it didn't really come up in my research. It certainly wasn't. I mean, fire was still a concern, of course, with nitrate films, but the Bazar de la the Bazar de la Charité wasn't necessarily maybe still on people's horizon. But safety, I mean, there were always multiple fires. I mean, there have been multiple fires in the history of the Cinematheque where they lost some of their collections. So that was certainly a concern still.
Mhm. I also love about you saying that you were speaking to Dana just before you sent in your manuscript and
Mm.
that she had met with Meerson in the past. So it's like you've become a part
Hmm.
of the lineage of that female leader. It's really beautiful. Joyce Schaefer asks, how does your work overlap with the Centre
Mm.
Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir? And how does the CF receive your work, if you know?
Yeah. So I do not talk about the Centre Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir in the book, but I could. Again, the book is not meant to be an exhaustive kind of history of all the ways that women have contributed to the film preservation movement in France. I honestly, I considered adding a chapter. So the Centre Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir was actually created, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s by Delphine Seyrig and others, so who were involved in kind of the video movement and the women's liberation movement. So there's a connection there because Seyrig also is connected to the Musidora collective. So there's certainly a collection there, and I think it's part of that lineage. But and I wanted to include a chapter on the Centre Audiovisuel Simone de Beauvoir, but because of the timeline for the book, it just wasn't doable. But if you read the book, I hope it will and know the work of the Saint Simone de Beauvoir, I hope it will resonate because they are very much part of that lineage. And the Cinémathèque française and my work on women. The Cinémathèque française is notoriously, I mean, how can I say this? Their record on supporting women filmmakers and initiating projects around, for example, Alice Guy Blaché and all that, is not hasn't been easy. Mm-hmm. But I have to say that they gave me access to the administrative archives without any problems, and I was in touch with Laurent Manoni, who's the great historian of the Cinémathèque française. I mean, his work has been a reference for me, and he's been very kind and in providing information. And kind of, I asked him to kind of fact check certain things because I wasn't sure, and he was able to do that. So yeah, they're aware of this research, and they've been helping it in some ways.
Okay, and then time for just one more question, I think. Emma Candland says, I'm so interested in the coexistence of work and family connections. There are siblings, life partners, etc., who are always co-workers or even director employees. You mentioned that the archive of the Cinémathèque had more personal stuff alongside these more mundane order forms. Of course, this has a lot to do with the emotional labor aspect. Would you have further thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So many family connections. I think, and I'm rereading, I'm sorry, you mentioned it. Yeah, so many personal connections, which I think necessarily informed the work that they were doing and the work environment in which they were, evolving. Certainly, you see traces of that in the archive. Like I said, like the stuff about Mary Meerson is wild a little bit. It's the letters between her and Langlois. I mean, and letters. There are sometimes notes on pieces of paper. They're really. I mean, it's just the more thinking about the ethics of reading those also. Like I'm not sure I should be reading those. But yeah, they're very personal. They have nothing. I mean, they had something to do with the Cinémathèque because I'm sure that had an impact on what the work looked like there. But they're about their own personal relationship, which was apparently very complicated. And that's certainly. I mean, she also has this image. She's always been talked about as like a little bit of a monster, honestly, and just because of her physique and also apparently her personality. I mean, there's stories about like her, murdering cats in the like hallways of the Cinémathèque Française or something like that. There's a whole legend around, like a whole legend that she kind of also cultivated by never revealing where she was born. Things like that, never really revealing her real age and things like that. So she certainly played with it, but then it's what people have kind of like, I think, talked about mostly in her, in relationship to her, in the histories, and it sort of obscured her work for sure. So like the personal relations, it's interesting to note that it's in a lot of cases, it gave women access to jobs in the film industry, jobs at the Cinémathèque Française, right? But it's also obscured their work there, I think, in the histories, right? Madeleine Maltête-Méliès was the granddaughter of Georges Méliès, and so she's kind of like, we don't talk necessarily too much about, although, I mean, Matthew Solomon has done work and has paid beautiful tribute to her, but she's, she's not talked about necessarily as kind of someone who's contributed to his history and the writing of history herself. So the personal and the kind of the personal and the professional are very much imbricated in super complex but fascinating ways.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think we're going to have to stop there. But Aurore, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak today. And I can see from our attendance that I'm not the only one who thoroughly enjoyed. Did you want to say anything else about where people can purchase the book or access the book? Or
you can purchase it on bookshop.org, I guess, on the University of California Press website. If you go on there, you can click on the flyer on the download. You can download the flyer and you'll have the code for the discount there. And I didn't list my email address on the PowerPoint, but if you Google me in Texas A&M, you'll find my faculty profile and my email address. So please feel free to email me with questions or thoughts, or this is ongoing research, or any feedback that you have for me will be absolutely wonderful.
Great. Thank you so much. And so just to finish up, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Next month, we'll be joined by Alex Feliciano Mejia, Assistant Professor of Critical and Digital Literacy at San Francisco State University, who will discuss his collaboration with the Cinémateca Universitaria of Guatemala's Universidad de San Carlos on the assessment, cataloging, and digitizing of a collection of approximately 800 films produced by the Tipografía Nacional between 1920 and 1950, which I think is going to be a very interesting talk. You can register for this event on our website, filmpreserve.org/events. You can keep up with everything we're doing on most social media platforms at SF Film Preserve. And thank you all so much for being here, and most particularly Aurore. Thank you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks, everyone.